Li Yang and Li Yu brought Yi Futian back to a private residence on Emperor Li's road. Li Yang and Li Yu brought Yi Futian back to a private residence on Emperor Li's road. Would you like me to station some people here? Li Yu asked Yi Futian. Li Xian may have promised not to do anything, but he had done so unwillingly. No need. If Li Xian were willing to trade his life for mine, he would have asked Yen Yuan for help, said Yi Futian. He had just gotten back. Who besides Li Xian would be trying to kill him? And Li Xian was not that stupid, especially because he thought that Li Xian's acting against him back there had been premeditated. He was not a simple scion of a noble house. Even though he had compromised in the end, all the time that Yi Futian had been pressing his sword into his throat, he had been extremely calm. All right, be careful, master, said Li Yu. But if you can, you should go to Sword Mountain to cultivate. She naturally meant well. All Yi Futian had to do was nod, and he would be able to go to Sword Mountain to cultivate. Because of the involvement of Sword Mountain, Li Xian did not dare to do anything rash against Yi Futian. After all, that was the foremost holy land for swordsmanship in the Dali dynasty, similar to Lihen Heaven in Emperor Xia's realm. The master of Sword Mountain was a saint at the fourth there of the Saint Plane, Nirvana, and he truly stood at the peak of the people in the Dali dynasty. There were few people like him. I will think about it carefully, said Yi Futian. Li Yang and Li Yu said farewell and left. After they left, Yi Futian sat down in the courtyard and closed his eyes to cultivate. Today's events had made him more vigilant. After coming to Dali, he had observed the situation and been cautious. He had not gotten into conflicts of interest with those who he could not compete with. And if he had been a bit arrogant, saint-level figures were too high above him to care about it. And even if they did care, they wouldn't kill him over it. But the affair with Li Xian had made him understand that here in the power center of Dali Imperial City, sometimes even when he did nothing, disasters could still befall him. Actually, this was not only true of Emperor Li's realm. The whole world was like this. Those who had cultivated weakly would die when battles broke out between powerful figures, and they would not even know why they were dying. Thus, there was only one way to avoid these threats that you could not see coming. Make yourself stronger. If he had not had enough combat power today, the saint would have directly killed him. He had truly wanted to slay him. Li Xian had not been joking. Thus, he had used his combat prowess to capture Li Xian with his sword and avoid danger. If he became a saint, then killing him would not be something that a saint at the first tier of the saint plane could do. However, the gap between sage and saint was extremely difficult to cross. It was like a moat. Many people were stopped on one side of it, and even if they worked their whole lives, they would never be able to cross it. Yi Futian pushed away these distracting thoughts and closed his eyes. It seemed there was a rustling sound ringing out through his life palace. The world tree was swaying and giving off jade green light. Many patterns were blooming around the tree. They were other life spirits. The world tree's light flowed towards his body and then spread out into the distance. Suddenly, Yi Futian felt that he had turned into a tree. His every thought and every piece of his aura were branches stretching out into the distance, to touch the essence of nature, heaven and earth. He could feel the power of heaven and earth. Man was modeled after heaven, after earth, after the path. And the path was modeled after nature. A marvelous airflow swept out from him and was immersed in his cultivation. When he had fought Yuan Jin at the Battle of Empty Realm, he had also entered this mysterious plane where he could sense the power of the great path. Since man made the path was an extension of man's will. Of course, to actually extend one's will was too hard. Yi Futian's perception was not strong enough right now. But by plunging himself into the path of the sword, he could already create many kinds of swords. He could gain a name for himself with his swords and thus walk around in Dali. The seventh swordsman was a powerful fighter, but that was, in fact, an illusion. Many months had passed since he had cultivated the Taishen Sword Sutra. Although his swordsmanship was already exquisite, he was more integrated with the power of multiple elements, and combined with the other skills he had learned while cultivating, he could unleash outstandingly powerful swords. Of course, his sword itself was not too bad. The Taishen Sword Sutra provided a general outline for his swordsmanship. He had cultivated many elemental powers, but he had truly cultivated different types of elemental sword magic. He had been able to apply these many kinds of abilities to his sword, so his swordsmanship alone was quite formidable. But if he could integrate the power he had before into his swordsmanship, it would naturally be even stronger. Now, he needed to forge an even more powerful sword so that he could truly make a name for himself with it and create a foothold in Dali. Futian did not go out for a while. He stayed in his residence, cultivating. However, Seventh Swordsman's name began to circulate in the outside world. Dali Academy had a prestigious place in Emperor Li's realm, and so the things that had happened were passed along quite quickly. Moreover, since the first person who Lu Chuan had brought from the lower worlds to cultivate, the Prince Regent's grandson, and Yen Yuan had all been there, it would have been impossible for the news not to spread. Many people in Emperor Xia's realm were curious the first time that Seventh Swordsman's name spread throughout the upper worlds. How strong was this man from the lower worlds who dared to stand directly outside Dali Academy and seek the path? Li Xian had ruined Seventh Swordsman's battles for seeking the path. If he had been able to continue, a much stronger disciple from Dali Academy would have come out, and then they would have been able to see. After a few days, some more slightly shocking news came out. And there were two sides to this news. The first was that a swordsman had come from 1,000 miles away in the primary holy land for swordsmanship in Dali Imperial City, Sword Mountain. It seemed that he had come for an appointment and had met with 7 swordsmen by chance. The reason that this was shocking was that the one who had come from Sword Mountain was Jian Wu, who was called the most outstanding disciple among the younger generation of Sword Mountain. He was at the limit of what was possible below the saint level. Once upon a time, many people had wanted to see a battle between Jian Wu and Yuan Jin and had speculated about who was stronger between them. However, Yuan Jin had fallen, and Dong Chen would probably take his place and become the personal disciple of the imperial advisor. Who was stronger, Dong Chen or Jian Wu of Sword Mountain? But Jian Wu's reason for coming was not Dong Chen of Dali Academy, but 7 swordsmen. From this, it could be seen that Sword Mountain thought highly of this junior swordsman who had come from the lower worlds. Indeed, he had made Jian Wu come off the mountain. The second reason the news was shocking was very similar to the first reason. It was because someone else had come to Dali Imperial City who was almost a saint. It was Di Hao of Daily Mountain. King Tiandao had always been overtly in conflict with the imperial advisor. The imperial advisor had founded Dali Academy, and so King Tiandao had founded Daily Mountain in the west as a holy land for cultivating. Not long ago, the imperial advisor had announced that he recalled his disciples. Now, the disciples of Daily Mountain were coming from far away. This made people speculate wildly. And the one who had come was Di Hao. King Tiandao controlled the Western Army, and all of the disciples of Daily Mountain had battle experience. They were all geniuses forged in the fires of battle. Di Hao had the honor of being the best disciple of Daily Mountain. King Tiandao thought very highly of him and had adopted him. So, how could someone like this coming to Dali Imperial City not cause a great disturbance? Especially since Jian Wu of Sword Mountain had also come. At that time, Yuan Jin and Dong Chen of Dali Academy, Di Hao of Daily Mountain, and Jian Wu of Sword Mountain were the best that there was below the saint level, and the most prestigious people at that level in the Dali dynasty. Yuan Jin had gone to the Battle of Empty Realm, but Dong Chen had not. As for Jian Wu, the imperial advisor had not wanted to order him to go and had wanted even less to have Di Hao go. Generally speaking, the imperial advisor's household was responsible for commanding the Battle of Empty Realm, and one of his disciples was always there. And it would obviously not be suitable for the imperial advisor's people to show up at the same place as King Tiandao's people. The 3 strongest figures in the Dali dynasty below the saint level were all in Dali Imperial City. Even though they weren't saints, they still attracted a lot of attention, and people had great expectations for them. Many people even wondered if the 3 of them would stand upon the same stage and battle. They would be able to see which one of them was worthy of being called the greatest figure in Dali Imperial City below the saint level. As for 7th Swordsman, he was naturally overlooked. Even though he had gained a little bit of fame outside Dali Academy, he was still not worth looking at when compared to those 3. How could the foremost person from the lower worlds compare with the strongest people from the upper worlds? Many people even argued about how many sword strokes 7th swordsman could last at Jian Wu's hands. As Dali Imperial City was being shocked by these two pieces of news, Yi Futian was improving his swordsmanship at his residence. He sat there cross-legged with an old tree beside him. The tree was swaying, and its leaves were falling off and swirling around Yi Futian. They seemed to circle him in some sort of majestic pattern. What was more incredible was that each leaf seemed extremely sharp. At that moment, Yi Futian suddenly opened his eyes. The leaves suddenly flew wildly as a terrible shriek rang out all around. The sound was ear-piercing, and the leaves all flashed in the same direction, seeming to cut through space itself. A wall was cut through piece by the leaves, and the whole thing crumbled to the ground. A vertical line appeared where the leaves had cut through, and on the other side of the wall, several figures appeared. The leaves flew back to Yi Futian and drifted behind him. "Your sword of raging storms is becoming as pure as flame," said Li Yu with a smile. "Why have you come?" asked Yi Futian with a bow. "You have been staying here practicing swordsmanship for several days, so you probably don't know what has happened in the outside world. You have a meeting with the shadow-bearing sword saint, who has just arrived in Dali Imperial City. And the most outstanding disciple of Sword Mountain, Jian Wu, has also come," said Li Yu. "Oh." Yi Futian nodded. It seemed that the shadow-bearing sword saint wanted to take him to Sword Mountain as a disciple. Otherwise, he would not have been so considerate. "You have been at peace here, but you don't know the disturbances that have taken place outside. Jian Wu is the best swordsman of Sword Mountain below the saint level. And not only that, he is one of the strongest people below the saint level in Dali Dynasty. The fact that the shadow-bearing sword saint brought him here means that he firmly wants to defeat you and bring you back to Sword Mountain with him," said Li Yu with a smile. "It would be good if Yi Futian went to Sword Mountain. Sword Mountain was the best place for practicing swordsmanship for those below the saint level." At that moment, Yi Futian thought of Wang Chuan. But this time, he would compete with his opponent with his sword. Chapter 1109. The Three Great Holy Lands for Cultivation in Dali. Yi Futian saw Li Yu smile and said, "If I am defeated, then I will fulfill my promise and go to Sword Mountain to practice my swordsmanship." Li Yu nodded. Sword Mountain is the best place in the Dali Dynasty to practice swordsmanship. If you were to go there to train, you wouldn't have to go to Dali Academy like last time. Li Yu was certain that Yi Futian would be defeated. No matter how strong he was, his opponent was stronger. He was the foremost junior of Sword Mountain. Yi Futian nodded slightly and didn't say any more arrogant things. If he gave it his all, he believed that he could defeat anyone in Dali below the saint level. But right now, he could only do it via his swordsmanship, and he had placed many constraints on himself. If he wanted to win, he could only do so with his sword. If he could not win with his sword, then even if he could defeat his opponent, he still could not win. If he won with his sword, then he won. If he lost with his sword, then he lost. If he faced an opponent like Wang Chuan, he still did not genuinely have absolute assurance of victory with his sword alone. "Oh right, one more thing. But it doesn't have much to do with you. Are you interested in hearing it?" asked Li Yu with a smile. "Please tell me," said Yi Futian with a nod. "Jian Wu is not the only one to come to Dali Imperial City now. Di Hao from Daily Mountain has come as well," she said. "Di Hao?" asked Yi Futian, confused. He knew of Daily Mountain. The records told him that it had been founded by King Tiandao, who controlled the Western Army. At the moment, there are three powerful holy lands for cultivation in the Dali Dynasty: Dali Academy, Daily Mountain, and Sword Mountain, said Li Yu slowly. Dali Imperial City is not among them, but in the eyes of the dynasty, it lies at the center of these three holy lands. Dali Academy, which was founded by the Imperial Advisor, is there. Since it receives the full support of His Majesty and has the advantage of being located in the Imperial City, it is considered the best of the three holy lands. The second best is Daily Mountain. King Tiandao has been stationed in the west for many years, and the Western Army completely controls that area. King Tiandao's household holds absolute power in the west. Many families and sects look to them for leadership. Given this background, King Tiandao was able to leverage the power he held in the West to call together all the young geniuses and found Daily Mountain. All the disciples of Daily Mountain have experience on the field of battle. That is how Daily Mountain, which is the foremost holy land in the West and the second best in all the land. The third best holy land for cultivating is Sword Mountain. Di Hao comes from Daily Mountain, and King Tiandao has adopted him. Many people look at him as the future king of the West. He has never been the Dali imperial city before, and the great figures of the city have no concrete information about his power. Still, many people speculate that he is the strongest person in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. None of the disciples of Dali Academy can defeat him, asked Yi Futian curiously. Dong Chen of Dali Academy is indeed very strong. Now that the imperial advisor is going to choose another disciple, Dong Chen is probably best qualified for the spot. Many people think it will be him. His strength is obvious, but King Tiandao is very conceited and arrogant. He probably sent Di Hao to Dali Imperial City to attack the cultivators that the imperial advisor has summoned. You can see the trust he puts in Di Hao, said Liu. Thus, there are those who call Di Hao the most powerful figure in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. Of course, some think it is Dong Chen. But without a doubt, one must add Jian Wu to that list. They are certainly the three most powerful figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty, and the most famous. And no, they will all be together in Dali Imperial City. But, Liu looked at Yi Futian and smiled. If you can defeat Jian Wu, you will be one of the top three. Of course, she was being polite. In reality, she didn't think Yi Futian could defeat Jian Wu. Yi Futian smiled and said nothing. Liu took her leave, saying, I will return. If there is more news, I will come tell you. You can just send someone to tell me, said Yi Futian. Very well. It's also possible that the people from Sword Mountain will personally visit us, said Liu with a nod. She couldn't keep coming here all the time. After Liu left, Yi Futian continued cultivating, doing all he could to integrate his power into his sword. He used Taishan Sword Sutra to temper his sword. The next time he faced a powerful foe, it wouldn't be like it had been in the lower worlds. Jian Wu of Sword Mountain was ranked in the top 3 figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty. The cultivators from Daily Mountain and Sword Mountain were arriving at Dali Imperial City one by one. The commotion shook the city at the center of the Dali dynasty. Everyone was waiting for some news. They did not have to wait too long. Soon, the people from Daily Mountain went to pay a visit to Dali Academy and arranged to go to Dali Academy again in 7 days to seek the path. Daily Mountain wanted to come into conflict with Dali Academy openly. And just like Yi Futian, they said they were seeking the path just because it sounded good. In reality, they were challenging them to battle. The 2 most powerful holy lands of the Dali dynasty were in open conflict. This was King Tiandao provoking the imperial advisor. He wanted to prove that Daily Mountain trained better disciples than Dali Academy. Since Di Hao had come, many people expected that they would get to see the battle between him and Dong Chen. Many people thought about what it would be like if Di Hao defeated Dong Chen. Would the imperial advisor's authority come under threat? Just as people were becoming worried about the imperial advisor, some news came from his household. In 7 days, the imperial advisor would personally come to Dali Academy. And he had invited all the top figures of Dali Imperial City to go and observe the forum. Even Sword Mountain was on the list of those invited. And on that day, he would choose his next disciple. There was a great stir in Dali Imperial City as the news spread. This was the imperial advisor's manner. Just as many people were worried about him and were afraid that he would be defeated, he had said that he would personally observe the battle and choose a disciple. No matter if he won or lost, he had shown himself to be 2 steps ahead of everyone else. On the second day, news also came from Sword Mountain. Jian Wu would invite someone to go to the forum at Dali Academy with him. 7th Swordsman. Suddenly 7th Swordman's name was once again ringing throughout Dali Imperial City. The strongest cultivators of the younger generation of Sword Mountain, Jian Wu, had challenged 7th Swordsman. The time, the day of the forum between Dali Academy and Daily Mountain. The place, Dali Academy. This news caused great waves and shocked all the people in Dali Imperial City. They were now full of great expectations for the forum in several days. Not only Dali Academy and Daily Mountain would be attending, but Sword Mountain would also be there and would fight with 7 swordsmen. The 3 greatest holy lands in the Dali dynasty would all be there, and so would the 3 strongest cultivators in the Dali dynasty below the saint level. On that day, Futian was still in the residence where he was staying, tempering his sword. At that moment, he had a slightly strange feeling. He opened his eyes and looked up into the distant sky. He saw a group of swordsmen flying over, and they landed outside his residence. "Greetings, 7th swordsman," came a voice from outside. "Please come in," said Futian. As he said this, the group of cultivators flew in and descended into the courtyard. They all looked at Futian, who was sitting there, cultivating. "I come in the name of the shadow-bearing sword saint with news. In 5 days, Sword Mountain will await you at Dali Academy. Please keep your promise," one of them said. Futian already knew from Liu that Jian Wu would be there, so he knew what the promise the man had mentioned was about. But he was a little surprised about the location. It would be at Dali Academy. "All right. Please tell the shadow-bearing sword saint that I will be there on time," answered Futian. "Very well. Farewell." The man nodded, and then the group of them flew up into the sky and disappeared in a flash. Not long after they left, Liu arrived and told him what had happened outside. This made Futian anticipate what would happen in 5 days at Dali Academy. The 3 strongest people in the Dali dynasty below the saint level would all be there together. The days finally passed as everyone in the city waited expectantly. On that day, powerful figures were continuously descending from the sky outside of Dali Academy. Some of them rode on swords, others on carriages. Some of the figures who were coming down from their carriages had powerful auras. Many people from the imperial family have come. Everyone's hearts trembled. It seemed that the imperial family was quite interested in this forum. A dragon roared in the sky, as a divine golden dragon came pulling a carriage. Several gold-robed figures were on the carriage. Everyone gasped as they saw them. It was not just people from the imperial family who had come, as even the prince of the Dali dynasty had come to Dali Academy. If Futian had seen this, he would have realized that the person on the carriage was the one that he had come to this place for. It was Li Yao, the prince of Dali Imperial City. The huge golden dragon descended outside Dai Academy, and the carriage came to the ground. The prince stepped into the academy, but no one came out to greet him. The imperial advisor had founded Dali Academy and had desired to train the best fighters of the Dali dynasty there. When he first founded it, His Majesty Emperor Li had once ordered people to build a statue outside the academy, a statue of the imperial advisor, highlighting his powerful position. However, when the imperial advisor found out about this, he had personally requested that the statue be torn down. Emperor Li had agreed, and the imperial advisor had destroyed the statue with his own hands. He had declared that Dali Academy did not advocate advancing the individual, but was to be a place for training cultivators for the Dali dynasty. There was no rank or authority here. Everyone who entered the academy was equal. However, after that day, the people of the Dali dynasty's respect for the imperial advisor only grew stronger. After this, His Majesty Emperor Li had personally ordered that anyone who entered Dali Academy must come down from their carriage. They could not rudely fly in, not even princes and princesses. Afterward, Emperor Li had made the princes and princesses go to Dali Academy to cultivate. Thus, now that Li Yao and his entourage had arrived, they still had to get out of their carriage, even though they were royalty. They had to walk into Dali Academy, and there was no one there to welcome them. This was Dali Academy, the foremost holy land for cultivating in the Dali dynasty. But today, Daily Mountain was coming there to seek the path. All the disciples of Dali Academy were gathered together, having shown up for the sparring session. There were many disciples on both sides of the area, but they were behaving in an orderly manner, casually chatting and occasionally casting glances off into the distance. All the disciples of Dali Academy were gathered together, having shown up for the sparring session. There were many disciples on both sides of the area, but they were behaving in an orderly manner, casually chatting and occasionally casting glances off into the distance. There were many seats on the steps in front of the sparring session platform that had been prepared for many of the elders that had come here today. There were already many more elders of Dali Academy waiting here than usual, and they were all looking off into the distance as well. The great disciple of Dali Academy, Yen Yuan, was already there. Li Yao and his entourage approached from the distance, coming in front of the building. They bowed slightly to Yen Yuan and the many saints of Dali Academy and called, "Greetings, sirs." Yen Yuan was usually responsible for events held at Dali Academy, and thus he was seated in the highest position. "Please, have a seat, Your Highness," said Yen Yuan with a slight smile. Li Yao and the others nodded, and 3 of them stepped forward and were seated. Afterward, more and more people arrived, many of whom were of the imperial family. There were many people of Emperor Li's bloodline in the city. Other than the few kings who had been given their titles by His Majesty himself, many others had been born into the imperial household. At that moment, many people were clustering around a single person. He was wearing a golden robe, and Li Xian stood by his side. Li Su was Li Xian's elder brother and the Prince Regent's grandson and had the highest status of the royal grandsons. Many people thought that he would one day inherit the Prince Regent's mantle. The Prince Regent's position in the imperial family was extremely high. After all, he was the emperor's uncle, and so he was highly respected. King Tiandao was extremely powerful, but he was His Majesty's brother. In some sense, King Tiandao and the emperor were the closest, being of such close blood. He did not bother to get closer to other members of the imperial family, and since he was in the West, the Prince Regent had gradually become the leader of the imperial family. As for King Li, although he was a king, not many people cared about him. His status was not very high. King Li was the weakest of the 4 kings, and so he had the lowest position. Although relationships between members of the imperial family were slightly delicate, Emperor Li did not care. This was the world of cultivators after all. If they didn't gang up and form cliques, how could they have any power? As long as the members of the imperial household did not do anything too improper and stayed within the rules, Emperor Li would not bother with their affairs. Emperor Li would not even ask questions about the conflict between King Tiandao and the imperial advisor. A little benign competition was not a bad thing for Emperor Li. And King Tiandao and the imperial advisor both had a sense of propriety. "Li Xian, I heard that several days ago, someone put a sword up to your throat. If Yen Yuan had not shown up, perhaps you would have been slain?" said a voice. Everyone looked up to where it had come from. The speaker was a young man next to Li Yao, who was wearing bright and beautiful robes. He looked a lot like Li Yao and was clearly someone extraordinary. And his aura was mighty. He was clearly at a very high level. This naturally another prince, Li Sun. He was Li Yao's brother and a saint-level figure. There was a bit of mockery in his words. Li Xian was of the same generation as these princes, but they were not very close. Li Xian naturally did not dare to be as arrogant as he usually was in the face of this opponent. He looked a bit embarrassed. He bowed slightly to Li Sun and said, "Your Highness, it was because I was too generous." "I think it was because you were too arrogant," said Li Sun with a smile. "He had come to Dali Academy to seek the path, and you tried to kill him. What a temper you have. But in the end, he got you. How does that feel?" Li Xian nodded. This matter had indeed been very shameful. "You'll have to cultivate more in the future and spend less time stirring up trouble," said Li Sun. He then looked at Li Su beside him. "Li Su, make sure to teach this guy well from now on. He's outrageous." "All right." Li Su nodded and bowed to Yen Yuan. "I apologize for disturbing you with this matter, sir." "It's no problem," answered Yen Yuan indifferently. He looked at Li Xian and saw him bowing his head. He was clearly uncomfortable right now. "Dong Chen is here," came a call. A group of figures appeared off in the distance, and suddenly everyone was making way for them. Dong Chen and his people were coming over. Birds of a feather flocked together. The people beside Dong Chen were all outstanding cultivators from Dali Academy. "Brother, Your Majesty," said Dong Chen to Yen Yuan and Li Sun. Li Yao and the others all bowed. "Daily Mountain is coming here on this day to seek the path. Make sure to prepare well," said Yen Yuan. "Yes, sir." Dong Chen took a polite step backward. Someone said, I heard that Hao Di of Daily Mountain will one day be named King of the West. King Tiandao has adopted him, so he must be a stunning figure. It will truly be amazing when he gets here to seek the path. Brother Dong Chen is full of learning. At the year-end sparring session last year, he took first place. I am very excited about the battle between him and the future King of the West. The disciples of Dali Academy were naturally full of confidence in Dong Chen. Dali Academy would definitely win this battle. I'm excited too, came a voice from outside. Everyone saw a black-robed figure walking in, with many people following him. When this person entered, there was an invisible aura all around. Everyone felt bursts of pressure. How can an elder of the Chao clan have time to come here today? Asked Li Sun with a smile. The one who had come was a cultivator of the Chao clan's demonic clan. He was an unblemished saint of the Chao clan. His name was Chao Zhan, and he was extremely powerful. This is a battle of the greatest figures below the saint level in the Dali dynasty, so naturally, I brought some of my juniors along to open up their eyes, said Chao Zhan. It seems that several members of the imperial family are here as well? Your juniors must be eager to get involved. Do they want to step onto the platform? Asked Li Sun with a smile. There are a few youngsters in the Chao clan who aren't bad, said Chao Zhan heartily. But they're nothing compared to Dong Chen and Di Hao. It seems that you have a clear understanding of your weaknesses, said Yan Yuan. Chao Zhan looked at Yan Yuan and said, I'm not looking to fight with you here at this sparring session for the youngsters. Please sit, said Yan Yuan. Chao Zhan stepped forward and took his seat. As for his juniors, they could only stand below him. Sword Mountain has come to greet Dali Academy, came a voice from outside. Soon, a group of swordsmen entered. The shadow-bearing sword saint was leading them, but the disciples of Dali Academy were paying attention to the young swordsman behind him. He was clothed in black and standing there calmly with no aura coming off of him. It was as if he did not exist. But he still gave people a strong sense of threat. He was one of the juniors of Sword Mountain, at the extreme of what was possible below the saint level. He was someone who was often mentioned in the same breath as Dong Chen, Jian Wu. Sword Mountain had been invited to Dali Academy, but Jian Wu had received a personal invitation to take part in the sparring session. The foremost figure of the Dali lower worlds, Seventh Swordsman, had also been brought here by the Imperial Advisor's disciple, Lu Chuan. It seems that the top figures of the Dali dynasty are all here today, said Li Sun with a smile. Beside him, Yan Yuan pointed out a seat and said, Please be seated. The shadow-bearing sword saint and the other elders of Sword Mountain took their seats, and their juniors stood beside them as they continued to wait. The important faction today was Daily Mountain, and they had not arrived yet. When Yi Futian arrived, he was much more low-key than the Chao clan and Sword Mountain. He had come with Li Yang and Li Yu. King Li had been garrisoned in the lower worlds for a long time, and his power was unmatched down there. But his influence in the upper worlds was relatively weak. After Yi Futian had arrived, the shadow-bearing sword saint's gaze fell upon him. Yuan Gang, who had once lost to Yi Futian, was also there. He said something quietly into the dark-clothed man's ear. Jian Wu's gaze turned to Yi Futian, and his eyes were as sharp as swords. But in a flash, he turned his gaze away. However, Yi Futian still felt it. But he did not look over at him. He just followed Li Yu into the crowd. Your Highness, sir. Li Yang and Li Yu bowed slightly to Li Xian and Yan Yuan. Li Yang, Li Yu, said Li Sun with a smile. You are becoming more and more beautiful, Li Yu. It seems like I will have to talk to your father when I have a chance and see if we can find a suitable family for a match. Even though they were of the same generation when it came to cultivating, there was a significant gap in their ages. Li Sun, Li Yao, Li Xian, Li Yu, and many others were all of the same generation, but Li Sun was older than them all. He was their elder brother, and kind of their elder. Moreover, he was prince, but by the way he spoke, he seemed very familiar with them. You must be joking, Your Highness. I'm serious, said Li Sun with a smile. He looked at Yi Futian beside her and said, This must be Seventh Swordsman. Seventh Swordsman of the lower worlds greets you, Your Highness, said Yi Futian with a bow. He naturally had seen that Li Yao was there, but he did not look at him as if he was a stranger. Right now, he was Seventh Swordsman, not Yi Futian, who had come for vengeance. If he wanted revenge, he would have to be patient. He had created the identity of seventh swordsman from the lower worlds with great difficulty, so he could not so quickly reveal himself. I heard that you defeated all the geniuses of the 9 commanderies of Greatly. That is very good. Before, you came to Dali Academy seeking the path. And now there is a battle of top talents here. You should observe it closely, said Li Sun. Yi Futian nodded. All right. Li Sun said nothing else. Li Yu and the others stepped back, but at that moment, Li Xian said coldly, Li Yang, Li Yu, it seems that you have ignored what I said last time. Li Yu turned and looked back at Li Xian. Seventh swordsman is my friend. Your friend? Said Li Xian coldly. You must have forgotten that I am your brother. Li Xian, it seems that you learned nothing from last time, yelled Li Sun. Li Xian suddenly bowed his head. Do not forget yourself again, said Li Sun. Li Xian nodded. Yes, sir. The disciple of Daily Mountain has come to seek the path. A voice came, shaking heaven and earth. Everyone suddenly looked up into the distance. The sound of footsteps seemed to come from far away, but a few moments later, everyone saw a group of figures coming towards them. These people had supernatural auras. They walked in good order, all in uniform, and all of them were light and carefree. Their manner showed how extraordinary they were. Dong Chen and his entourage walked out of the crowd and looked towards the figures that were coming. Their opponents had arrived. Many people had come from Daily Mountain, and the one at their head had a powerful aura. He was a saint who had cultivated to be very powerful. They walked to the front of the platform, then stopped, and swept their gazes over the seats. They bowed slightly and said, Greetings, Your Highness. Many people had come from Daily Mountain, and the one at their head had a powerful aura. He was a saint who had cultivated to be very powerful. They walked to the front of the platform, then stopped, and swept their gazes over the seats. They bowed slightly and said, Greetings, Your Highness. Today, you have come here to take part in the sparring session. We are just here to watch, so there is no need to be so polite. Don't worry about us, said Li Sun with a smile. Dali Academy and Daily Mountain were the 2 strongest holy lands in the Dali dynasty. He was also looking forward to the battle between these 2 vast holy lands. It would undoubtedly be marvelous. At that moment, Lu Sun's gaze fell upon a young man who was standing among the crowd. He was standing up straight and tall and was looking forward calmly. No emotion could be seen in his bright and clear eyes. They were as calm and still as water. However, even so, the people in the crowd took notice of him as soon as they saw him. Some people had this kind of quality, that even when they were in a crowd, everyone would look at them. Di Hao of Daily Mountain was said to be the strongest person in the Dali dynasty below the saint level, and he had cultivated himself to be infinitesimally close to the saint plane. The cultivators of Daily Mountain greet our brothers on the path from Dali Academy. The cultivators from Daily Academy may have come seeking the path, but they still expressed themselves very politely. Not a trace of arrogance or taunting could be seen from them. It was as if they had just come to pay a visit. You are all so polite. Please sit. Yen Yuan pointed out the seats for the cultivators from Daily Mountain. The elders of Daily Mountain took their seats, while Di Hao and the other youths remained standing. They had come to seek the path, not a banquet. The disciples of Dali Academy were also standing. They would not sit either. The imperial advisor is coming, said Li Sun. From far away, they could see another group of figures coming. In the crowd, Yi Futian also looked up. Among the group of people who were coming were Lu Chuan, who he had seen before. But this time, Lu Chuan was standing behind someone else. He was a middle-aged man wearing sky-blue robes. His face was square and even, and there was no strong sense of majesty coming off him, making him seem like an elegant and refined person. But even though there was no aura bursting from him, one could still feel that he had a strong spirit within him. Everyone sitting in their seats rose, even the princes Li Yao and Li Sun and the great figures from the top forces. All of them bowed to him. The disciples of Dali Academy and Daily Mountain naturally did the same, and they respectfully called out to the one who was coming, Greetings, Imperial Advisor. No matter if you liked him or not, no matter if you sympathized with him or not, As soon as you saw this middle-aged man, you could do nothing but bow respectfully and call out his name. He had not been born into the imperial family, but he stood at the peak of the Dali dynasty and was said only to be subject to one person. Moreover, even if you didn't like him, you had to admit that he had worked his heart out for the Dali dynasty. He had bent his mind and skill towards training people. He was even basically responsible for carrying out the Battle of Empty Realm. This middle-aged man was indeed the top figure in Emperor Li's realm. Dali Academy alone had trained countless top cultivators. Before he had come to the Dali dynasty, Futian had heard a lot of rumors about him in the Battle of Empty Realm. Many in Emperor Xia's realm even said that he was a strange and evil man who practiced dark magic. But since coming to Dali, all he had seen and heard was the absolute admiration that people in both the upper and lower worlds had for him. Even the princes of Dali Imperial City bowed to him when they saw him. King Tiandao's household was not at peace with the imperial advisor, but the people of Daily Mountain still had to show respect when they saw him. This was what he had seen of the imperial advisor in the Dali dynasty. He had wondered what kind of person this man, who stood at the peak of the Dali dynasty, was. Perhaps only those who stood beside him could truly know anything about him. The imperial advisor walked to his seat and bowed slightly to Li Sun and the others, saying, "May I be seated, Your Highness?" "Please," said Li Sun politely. The imperial advisor was not a stickler about where he sat, and so Li Sun and the others always left him several possible places of honor at the center. After he sat, the imperial advisor looked at the vast sparring field before him. With only a glance, he gave everyone there a strange feeling. It was as if he were looking directly at them. Everyone had this same feeling, and Futian was no exception. There are many holy lands for cultivating in Dali dynasty, but few of them are in contact with each other. Today, Daily Mountain has come seeking the path, and this is a good thing. Thus, I have invited many people from Dali Imperial City and Sword Mountain to come and witness the sparring session, said the imperial advisor. For the vast majority of people, there are boundaries to cultivation, and once you have reached a certain level, it is difficult to move forward. You can only wait for your juniors to overtake you. I hope that the juniors of the Dali dynasty can continue to surpass their elders. As a member of the Dali dynasty, seeing so many outstanding juniors gathered here for this sparring session soothes my heart. If you all can keep coming to seek the path in the future, that would be a beautiful thing. When you spar with each other, you can see your weaknesses, scrutinize yourself, and then keep moving forward. Today I will choose a disciple from among those sparring here. Of course, if he is not willing, I will not force him. I now give you all time to yourselves. And on saying this, he said no more. In reality, all the disciples of both Dali Academy and Daily Mountain were outstanding people, and all of them were at the sage level. There were many things that their elders didn't need to do. Here all they had to do was observe. These disciples would do very well on their own. At that moment, a figure walked out of the group of disciples of Daily Mountain. There was a fierce expression on his face. He wanted to look even more dangerous than Dihao. His eyes were as sharp as knives, and he gave off a pressing aura. But this aura was not too strong. When he released his rule power, everyone could feel that he had only cultivated up to the lower sage level. But he was undoubtedly at the peak of that plane. I am Kuang Shao of Daily Mountain. I have no name of my own as found on the battlefield and brought back by the army. The king gave me my name as my father probably died in battle. The youth looked at the disciples of Dali Academy. In this life, most of my time has been spent either cultivating or in battle. I have killed many enemies and have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat many times. The disciples of Dali Academy cultivate here in the city, reading books. Yet, they receive the respect of the masses and enjoy many cultivation resources, even though they have rarely experienced the threat of death. This is because no one dares to do anything against them. Thus, I wish to test if my cultivation methods are better, or if those of Dali Academy are better. Kuang Zhao's dashing spirit was carried in his voice, and he did not hide his talent. Even the bit of aura that he was projecting was extremely wild. Unlike Daily Mountain, Dali Academy was located in a city. Thus the environment that the disciples of Dali Academy lived in was indeed much more peaceful. And each disciple of the academy was relatively famous, with everyone knowing about them. In contrast, the cultivators of Daily Mountain, which was located in the west, often faced death on the battlefield, and yet few in the Dali dynasty knew their names. Only Di Hao attracted anyone's attention. This diatribe that Kuang Shao had launched against the disciples of Dali Academy was calling Dali Academy itself into question, as well as the imperial advisor's ideas. In some sense, Daily Mountain's attitude was king of the West Tiandao's attitude. Li Sun looked at Kuang Shao. His kingly uncle seemed to want to prove something by this sparring session. The cultivators of Dali Academy talked among themselves quietly, and then a mighty and powerful figure walked out from their midst. That is Qian Shan, who has been called the most talented student of rhythmic sorcery in Dali Academy, Liu told Yi Futian. Dali Academy naturally did not only have top-level sages. It had cultivators of all levels. And Qian Shan was an extremely powerful lower-level sage. After he had stepped forward, Qian Shan bowed to the crowd, then looked towards Kuang Shao and said, "The great path is long. There is no weakest person on it, just those who are better suited and those who are less suited. Reading leads to cultivation, as does killing enemies on the field of battle. There is no distinction about which is better. Moreover, we do not receive cultivation resources and the respect of the masses just because we are disciples of Dali Academy. Any time the Dali dynasty needs us, we can go to war." In last year's Battle of Empty Realm, Brother Yuan Jin died on the field of battle. Everyone nodded slightly. Qian Shan's argument was outstanding. "You may say there is no distinction about which is better, but there is," said Kuang Shao. His wild aura swept out from him. Qian Shan nodded. "Please." He knelt on the vast sparring field, and a guqin spirit appeared. He began to pluck the guqin, and the notes resonated. The melody was warm and calm, seemingly able to calm the anger of a human heart. Kuang Zhao's life spirit blossomed, and the figure an impossibly giant beast appeared behind him, full of ferocity and anger. It was the vicious beast Taowu. A suffocating pressure swept across the sparring field, and Kuang Shao suddenly stepped forward. The ground trembled continuously. He seemed to be one with Taowu, having transformed into a beast of war as he charged at Qian Shan. Qian Shan continued plucking the guqin strings, and the notes resonated with heaven and earth. Suddenly, an invisible force pierced through everything as the musical sorcery turned into invisible power and shot towards Kuang Shao and Taowu, slowing them down considerably. Hearing the music, Yi Futian felt that the worldly rules had been infected by it. It seemed that in that area, everything would only move according to the music. Even those watching on the sidelines had an illusion that their perception and movements had been slowed. Kuang Shao will probably lose, thought Yi Futian. Although he was very wild and his combat ability was very high, Qian Shan's music could control him. Moreover, as a disciple of Dali Academy, Qian Shan's rule spells would certainly not be weak. Sure enough, a snowstorm seemed to appear along with the trembling notes. The temperature plummeted, and waves began to crash towards his opponent. The whole area seemed to have turned into a sea world, and the watery prison affected Kuang Zhao's movements. As soon as Kuang Shao had stepped forward, the disciples of Dali Academy must have guessed that he was good at close combat. Kuang Zhao's attack was extremely brutal. Even if it was being sealed by frost and bound by the water prison, it continued its wild attack toward the other. With his body as the center, many giant Taowu appeared, rushing forward and tearing away at the frosty seal. At this moment, his body seemed to be fused with the Taowu, and this incredibly violent war beast stood in front of Qian Shan. Its sharp claws clamped down, trying to destroy and vanquish the space. Kuang Zhao's attack was extremely brutal. Even if it was being sealed by frost and bound by the water prison, it continued its wild attack toward the other. With his body as the center, many giant Taowu appeared, rushing forward and tearing away at the frosty seal. At this moment, his body seemed to be fused with the Taowu, and this incredibly violent war beast stood in front of Qian Shan. Its sharp claws clamped down, trying to destroy and vanquish the space. Qian Shan sat quietly. In this space of illusion, he seemed to be at the bottom of the ocean. He did not look up, only stroking the strings, and the musical notes turned into ripples of sound waves, rushing into the ears of Kuang Shao. The closer he got to Qian Shan, the stronger the power that oscillated, rocking his entire will so that everything in front of him seemed somewhat blurred. But even so, it was impossible to stop him from continuing his attacks. The water waves roared upon Qian Shan, and a water dragon encircled around his body, moving upward, and then rushed to the war beast and entangled the body of the other, which blocked Kuang Zhao's attack. Along with a violent shock, their two bodies were simultaneously slammed backward. Kuang Shao is on the verge of defeat, many exclaimed inside their hearts. The technique of Qian Shan's music was able to weaken Kuang Zhao's combat ability continuously. At the beginning of the battle was when Kuang Shao had the most chance to win. Still, as that attack did not overcome his opponent, the likelihood of another opportunity later in the fight was slight. As expected by everyone, the battle lasted quite a long time. Qian Shan's musical spell defended Kuang Zhao's violent attacks until Kuang Shao was weakened to his eventual defeat by Qian Shan. Much obliged. Qian Shan collected the Guqing spirit, got up, and bowed to the cultivators of Daily Mountain, then returned among the disciples of the Dali Academy. Kuang Zhao's face was icy, and there were blood stains at the corners of his mouth. He also returned to the people of Daily Mountain. Did you understand? Among the crowd of Daily Mountain, next to Di Hao, a young man looked at Kuang Shao and asked. Kuang Shao bowed his head. On the battlefield, if defeated, it often meant death. He was the first one of the Daily Mountain to battle, therefore the defeat was particularly shameful. On the battlefield, you were brave enough to face thousands, rushing into the army without hesitation, but from the very beginning, Qian Shan of Dali Academy restricted your ability. His musical talent was superb and his spells extraordinary. Even though you possessed immensely strong offensive powers, it was still difficult for you to fully exert your power. After you return to Daily Mount, you should self-reflect. Empty courage ultimately will achieve nothing. In addition to the trials of life and death, more studying is needed, the young man continued to lecture. Many people looked with surprise at the young man. From what he had said, it seemed that the battle was just a trial for the disciples of Daily Mountain, not a real battle to seek the way. He had used this battle to teach Kuang Shao, a disciple of Daily Mountain. Yes, senior brother. Kuang Shao bowed his head. He seemed to be extremely respectful to the young man. The young man stepped forward, and suddenly, the eyes of all the disciples of the Dali Academy fell on him. The affectation of the young man was even more extraordinary than Kuang Shao, and he was about half a head taller. He was clad in all black, and his eyes, though calm, were extremely deep. This person stood next to Di Hao among the disciples of the Daily Mountain, and from this alone, one could detect his status. Presumably, he was mighty. 7 Sins of Daily Mountain, swordsman of the Peak of Sage Plain, half-step into St. Plain, pleased to meet you. The moment his voice fell, an invisible sword will instantly envelop the entire platform, cold and sharp. Although he was still standing there calmly, there was an extreme sense of danger coming out of him. The faces of the disciples of Dali Academy were darkened. Clearly, this person was very powerful. Moreover, when he introduced himself, he bluntly declared that he was a swordsman, half-step into St. Plain. This was a kind of self-confidence. He informed everyone of his level of cultivation. He released the atmosphere so the other party could perceive it, allowing Dali Academy to choose the next person to answer the battle call. Even the eyes of those from Sword Mountain were focused on this person who walked out. Many of the swordsmen in training wore a grave look on their faces. From the sword will that was released from the other, they had felt an authoritative pressure of sword way. 7 Sins, swordsman in training. This was a cultivator who did not enjoy any fame in Dali Imperial City. Before now, almost no one had heard of his existence. Never mind him, even Di Hao was only known because of his adopted father, King Tiandao. The people of Dali focused on Dali Academy way more than they did Daily Mountain, especially inside this imperial city. Dali Academy had countless cultivators, which was a conglomeration of all the elites of Dali. Naturally, some were half-step into the St. Plain. If Di Hao did not answer the call of battle, clearly, Dongchen would not either. Otherwise, who could battle Dihao? At this time, a disciple from Dali Academy stepped out. He was wearing a golden shirt and seemed very thin. When he stepped onto the platform, the sword will released from 7 sins could be felt, yet his footsteps were steady. A ray of golden light permeated from him, and there seemed to be a strange rhythm that rocked the invisible space, which gradually turned into a strong pressure sweeping toward 7 sins. Zhuozong. Many were not surprised to see the appearance of this person. In Dali Academy, Dong Chen and Zhuozong were the closest to Saint Plain. At the most recent battle forum at Dali Academy, Dong Chen was first and Zhuozong was second. Zhuozong, a disciple of the Dali Academy, pleased to meet you, Zhuozong said. As his voice fell, the golden robe fluttered without wind, and a suffocating pressure shrouded the forum platform. At this instant, although the two had not yet made any exchanges, they were already competing with their aura, and the airflow on the platform became extremely agitated. Even the cultivators around them could feel that suffocating pressure. The sword will was madly condensing, and everyone could see violent currents of sword wei gathering in front of 7 sins, making sharp and harsh sounds. It was followed by a sword, suspended in front of him, humming. This sword looked to be greedily devouring of the currents of sword wei that rose between heaven and earth. The sword itself was extremely thin, but there was a terrible texture carved upon it, puffing out shocking radiance. Many people of Sword Mountain showed a sharpness in their eyes. Their expression now mirrored that of a sharp sword. Even the shadow-bearing sword saint was moved slightly. Sword of Kasyapa, shadow-bearing sword saint said. Suddenly, many of the powerful principles people were stunned. The name of the sword of Kasyapa originated from a Kasyapa sword saint many years ago, whose sword wei was unparalleled. He was known as the first person of the Dali sword wei. Later, the Kasyapa sword saint had gone missing, and the sword of Kasyapa never surfaced again. Now, could the sword in the hand of 7 sins be the sword of Kasyapa? The sword was thin as a leaf, and indeed the shape of a leaf could be faintly detected. Although it was extremely thin, its sword will was astounding. First sword, 7 sins spat, and the sword shot out like a light. It disappeared in a flash. Zhuozong apparently also perceived the strength of the other. He released his life spirit, and suddenly a golden brilliance flowed upon his torso, a huge golden shadow covering him, just like an ancient golden god. A loud bang rocked the void and let out a roar, and a terrible storm swept out and turned into countless golden spears. However, the sword penetrated directly and split one of the golden spears down the middle, but did not touch the other spears. It continued the forward momentum towards Zhuozong, as fast as light. The huge golden palm of Zhuozong lifted up and slammed toward the sword. It was like the waves of a storm, and even the void trembled. However, that sword was far too thin. As if there was nowhere to exert the force, it directly pierced into the golden palm print and penetrated it bit by bit. It came out from the back of the palm, continuing to stab towards Zhuozong. On the golden body of Zhuozong, brilliant golden lines also appeared, and a clear sound was heard. Terrible shockwaves swept out, but in the face of this terrible storm, the sword still stabbed toward that golden torso, penetrating bit by bit. Halfway it was finally blocked. The disciples of the Dali Academy looked grave. Zhuozong's offensive and defensive skills were considered unparalleled below the Saint Plane, but the sword of his opponent actually penetrated him halfway. Zhuozong wanted to grab onto the sword with his left hand but saw that the sword instantly exited, like a golden streaming light. It then wrapped around and twirled above Zhuozong's body. Many people look at 7 sins again. He was controlling the sword. Not only that, but a second sword appeared in front of him. Second sword. As his voice fell, the sword struck again. It once again went towards Zhuozong. At the same time, the first sword also started to move back. The two swords simultaneously cutting the body of the ancient god that was summoned by Zhuozong, tearing it apart little by little. A loud noise seemed to rock heaven and earth. Zhuozong stepped out, allowing the swords to cut at him while he continued walking toward 7 sins. A golden arm smashed toward 7 sins. When his foot stepped down, There was a pressure of the way that covered this space and oppressed the void. Seven Sins stood indifferently. He looked up and glanced at the arm that was slamming toward him. Sword will surrounded his body, tearing the void. In an instant, Seven Sins broken through the sky, as if ignoring the pressure, and his body disappeared. Then, the body of the Seven Sins appeared above Zwazong. The way of the space. The sword of Cassiopeia could only be cultivated by those who specialized in the way of the space. The third sword. In front of Seven Sins, the third sword of Cassiopeia stabbed forward. Upon the immense body of Zwazong, suddenly, there appeared many golden arms, grabbing toward the void at the same time. The figure of Seven Sins disappeared once more, like a golden afterimage, shuttling upon the platform. His spiritual willpower was released to the extreme. While dodging, he still controlled the swords that cut at the body of Zwazong without ceasing. The disciples of the Dali Academy looked serious. If this continued, Zwazong would be defeated. As they expected, when the sword of Cassiopeia manifested the 13th time, a terrible storm of the sword of Cassiopeia started around Zwazong. His huge golden battle form was now being slashed and shattered, slowly being destroyed. Soon, even the incomparably sturdy body of the ancient god could no longer be sustained, and its body collapsed and shattered. The 13 swords surrounded Zwazong's body. The sword will was covering the sky. The body of Seven Sins suspended in the sky, still looking indifferent. Zwazong of the Dali Academy had been defeated. Many looked up at Seven Sins, who was in the void. It was unexpected that besides Di Hao, there still existed such a strong person. So, just how strong was Di Hao? Even if Yi Futian's eyes, while looking at Seven Sins, changed somewhat, the one who stood at the peak of Dali was indeed extraordinary. I didn't expect the sword of Cassiopeia, which had been lost for a long time, to appear here today. It was certainly worth the trip, shadow-bearing sword saint said. Could he compete with Jianwu? Asked Li Sun. He certainly could. Shadow-bearing sword saint nodded, and everyone looked at Seven Sins. Jianwu was praised as the first swordsman of Dali under the Saint Plane, the first disciple of Sword Mountain. Seven Sins could compete with him. This demonstrated the formidable strength of Seven Sins. Today's forum battle has gotten even more interesting. I didn't know if we would be seeing the sword battle of the younger generation of Dali, to see the sword of Sword Mountain compete with the sword of Cassiopeia. The shadow-bearing sword saint looked at Jianwu and then looked at Yi Futian. The Sword Mountain had come to Emperor Li's city to fulfill a contract to allow Jianwu to descend the mountain and to defeat the seventh swordsman so he could cultivate at Sword Mountain. Now, there was also a peak swordsman in Daily Mountain and the appearance of the long-lost sword of Cassiopeia. Li Sun noticed the gaze of the shadow-bearing sword saint and suddenly looked at Yi Futian, saying, I almost forgot that this trip of the Sword Mountain was to come for the seventh swordsman. Seventh swordsman is the first swordsman from the lower worlds. What is your opinion of the sword of Seven Sins? Many people looked at Yi Futian. At this moment, it was the first time that many top figures of Dali had truly noticed Yi Futian. Among them, there was the advisor of Dali and the royal prince of Dali. Many people looked at Yi Futian. At this moment, it was the first time that many top figures of Dali had truly noticed Yi Futian. Among them, there was the advisor of Dali and the royal prince of Dali. Yi Futian's eyes fell on Li Sun, and he saw that Li Yao, who was next to Li Sun, was also looking at him. However, Li Yao would not know who he was, or for whom he came for. Once upon a time in the 9 states, Li Yao caused Jiyu's death and also caused the death of many in the 9 states. In the empty realm, Li Yao forced him to react after he was defeated. Yaya and senior brother were both seriously injured. Both of them and Wuchen almost died in the battle. If it weren't for the sword from the sword master of Lihan that allowed Yi Wuchen to block the attack, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Therefore he came to Dali. There were some things that he needed to do. If it was merely relying on cultivation to kill Li Yao, and judging from Li Yao's status, when would that be? But even though his heart was full of hatred, his eyes were calm and without disturbance. He did not cast so much as a sideways glance at Li Yao. He merely focused on Li Sun and said, the way of the sword was outstanding, and its power was truly amazing. When many heard what Yi Futian had to say, they secretly agreed. Seven Sins was indeed outstanding. This man himself had once come to the Dali Academy, also seeking instruction. He was now known as the first person of the Dali lower realm. He must have been quite extraordinary himself. However, this time, Jian Wu of the Sword Mountain and Seven Sins were both present. There were also Dong Chen and Di Hao, two peak characters, so there wouldn't be much required of him. However, it was still an opportunity to observe and learn. Li Sun nodded with a smile and said, "Today is a rare opportunity. Sword Mountain came because of you. There are also two great young swordsmen in training at their peak, a great way to sharpen your sword way. You can ask them for instruction later." "I do not agree with your highness," Yi Futian said. "Why?" asked Li Sun. "Your highness said that Jian Wu and Seven Sins are the great young swordsmen of Dali. Though the first sword of Sword Mountain and the sword of Seven Sins are strong, they may not necessarily be at the peak. The sword of Seven Sins had fatal flaws. If your highness wanted to talk about the peak sword way below the Saint Plane, then I ought to be included," Yi Futian said. "Oh." Hearing his words, Li Sun showed a look of surprise. All witnessed the force of Seven Sins' sword. He had realized the way of the space and integrated it into the sword. The power of the sword of Cassiopeia was unparalleled. But the seventh swordsman claimed that the sword of Seven Sins had fatal flaws. Many who knew the name of the seventh swordsman had heard that his entire mind was bent on seeking the way of the sword. His behavior was quite arrogant, and he thought that his sword way was the one and only. It seemed that this was indeed the case. He had come alone to seek the way from Dali Academy. He had just witnessed the sword of Seven Sins in action, but he was now saying that there were imperfections in the sword of Seven Sins. The seventh swordsman felt that he ought to be the person at the peak of the sword way. However, in the eyes of most people present today, the seventh swordsman, though outstanding in his own right, he was bound to be at some distance from the few who were at the peak of the Dali upper realm. Li Sun did not deny Yi Futian's claim but said, "If so, let me witness your sword. How about it?" Yi Futian looked toward Li Sun. The status of Li Sun as the royal prince of the Saint Plane was no lesser than Li Yao. "Since your highness wishes to see, I will oblige," Yi Futian responded. He stepped forward and looked at Seven Sins in the crowd of Daily Mountain. He called out, "The seventh swordsman in training, ask for instruction in the way of the sword." Seven Sins cast a glance at Yi Futian. He did not recognize who he was. He came here today for Dali Academy. And this person just critiqued his sword as having fatal flaws. He naturally relegated it as nonsense. Seven Sins looked at Yi Futian. He did not speak and did not step out. Many eyes were looking toward the direction of Daily Mountain, falling on Seven Sins. For a time, this space was rather silent. Seven Sins did not respond to the call of battle, not because he dared not to. His eyes were casual and calm, and he moved his sight away. It was as if he had not heard anything Yi Futian said. The cultivators of the Daily Mountain, likewise, glanced at Yi Futian. No one spoke. The silent space was like a silent jeer. Yi Futian dared to criticize that the sword of Seven Sins, so it was understandable that the people of Daily Mountain would eschew all etiquette on that account. The silence at the moment was a statement. Not just anyone could ask Seven Sins of Daily Mountain for a fight. Seven Sins did not care to move his little finger. Many people felt uncomfortable in this slightly embarrassing atmosphere. This first swordsman from the lower worlds was obviously not quite up to par. Even if he had personally asked for Seven Sins to instruct the way of the sword, he was ignored by Seven Sins. Those in power felt the embarrassing atmosphere of the forum, but they did not speak, just watching Yi Futian. How would this swordsman in training handle the situation? Li Sun looked at Yi Futian. His face changed slightly. This embarrassing situation would make Yi Futian feel he was losing face. Shadow-bearing sword saint was thinking whether or not to ask Jian Wu to step out instead to resolve the impasse. This seventh swordsman was dedicated to seeking the way of the sword, and his speech was quite arrogant. The unparalleled in the lower worlds also had the right to be arrogant. It was only that in the upper worlds, among the top figures here, it was inevitable that this attitude would suffer some disadvantage. However, with the right challenges and trials, great achievement was a definite outcome. Of course, Yi Futian knew that he was being ignored, but he did not feel anything out of the ordinary when he saw the reaction of the people of Daily Mountain. Being ignored was, in itself, quite within expectation. After all, this was one of the two strongest holy lands to cultivate in Dali Imperial City, and Seven Sins was someone who stood at the top. Seventh Swordsman in Training asks Daily Mountain for instruction of the way, Yi Futian continued, and this time, he was not asking for Seven Sins only, instead, he was asking Daily Mountain. In other words, anyone from Daily Mountain would suffice. The people of Daily Mountain glanced at him and saw Yi Futian standing there. His body stood tall. It seemed as if he had not felt any shame whatsoever. After being ignored the first time, he was still insisting. In the direction of Daily Mountain, a burly figure walked out. It was a cultivator of the sage plain of Daily Mountain. Today, it was Daily Mountain asking Dali Academy for instruction, not an occasion for Yi Futian to cause trouble. However, since he had affected them, they had to clean it up. The cultivator who came out did not announce himself, but merely stepped right out and released a terrible force. "Are you ready?" asked Yi Futian. "Get it on," the other responded coldly. Yi Futian's palms stretched out, and suddenly, sword will started whistling. It surrounded him and gathered into a massive sword in front of him. This heavy sword rotated in front of Yi Futian, whistling and humming, and its breath was getting stronger and stronger with terrible power. The force that came out of it contained a strong sense of annihilation. A few cultivators of Daily Mountain expressed a stern look. This person did not seem to be weak. Raising his palm, Yi Futian reached out and clasped the end of the sword, and then pushed the sword forward with breakneck speed. Loud noises whistled. The Daily Mountain cultivator suddenly lunged forward with both palms extended forward, and a golden pattern appeared in front of him immediately. Yi Futian came with the sword, and his palm pressed toward the front. As the sword arrived, the loud roaring noise came out, and instantly the golden pattern exploded and was pulverized. The heavy sword continued its movement forward. The cultivator let out an angry roar. His face changed slightly, and he stepped out once again. His life spirit was released, and a huge golden behemoth appeared. The strength of both palms, like a hurricane, blasted out fiercely. Yi Futian ignored the attempt of the other, and his palm continued to push the heavy sword. Everything shattered and exploded, and the body of the other continued to backpedal. He let out sounds of frustrated exertion, and it was still useless. His feet ground against the floor and the clothing on his arms were shredded. Blue veins on his arms were bulging. The sounds of friction could be heard as if his bones were about to be crushed. Yi Futian did not deal a fatality. He had folded one hand behind him, using only his right hand pushing forward, oppressing the other with the ease of a stroll. "Enough!" A voice was heard, and Yi Futian stopped to turn his head, looking toward the direction of Daily Mountain. Over there, Seven Sins walked out and looked at Yi Futian. His expression was as sharp as a sword. Clearly, this battle made him feel that Yi Futian possessed incredible strength. Yi Futian let go of the opponent, and the sword disappeared. He went to Seven Sins, and the two stood face to face. "My sword, what's wrong with it?" asked Seven Sins. "Are you ready?" Yi Futian asked the same as he had before. Seven Sins frowned and replied, "Yes." He needed no preparation. Around him, the sword will shot to the sky, and the sword of Cassiopeia was condensing. But as he was concentrating on forming the sword, Yi Futian's body turned into a stream of light, and Seven Sins felt that he was locked down by spiritual power. Yi Futian had a sword in his hand, a common-looking sword. But when the sword struck, a horrible storm that came between heaven and earth appeared. It was as if everywhere it passed, everything would be crushed. So fast. Everyone blinked, and then they saw the sword will of Seven Sins coursing out. His body seemed to disappear. It was like a light that moved in and out of thin air. However, in the next moment, everyone's pupils contracted. They saw that Yi Futian had also disappeared. In the void, Yi Futian's sword was still swinging. This sword seemed to have accompanied him traversing the void and was aimed directly at Seven Sins. The sword will around 7 sins was extremely powerful, and it madly screamed toward Yi Futian for the kill, but Yi Futian was also surrounded by an equally terrible sword storm. Buzz. 7 sins once again disappeared from where he was standing. Almost at the same time, everyone saw that Yi Futian had also disappeared. The pupils of everyone contracted and stared at the battlefield. They saw a sword. This sword seemed to be a sword from another dimension, appearing through the void so that there seemed to be a sword light crossing the space of the void. From that sword light, it seemed that the position of the two could be deciphered. All of this, in fact, happened in an instant, and there only seemed to be a sword that crossed heaven and earth. In the next instant, 2 figures appeared at the same time. Yi Futian stood in the void, but 7 sins appeared on the forum platform. The sword in his hand was broken. 7 sins looked somewhat bewildered at the sword that had not yet formed, and his face was slightly pale. Not only him, but many people around him trembled and watched the scene in front of them with shock. 1 sword strike. That beautiful scene in the void was just 1 sword strike. 7 sins, the swordsman who stood at the peak of Dali, whose sword was cut in half by another. Those from Daily Mountain looked extremely concerned, and they looked up at Yi Futian. I said, "Your flaw was too fatal," Yi Futian said. The sword of Cassiopeia was mighty and would get stronger as the battle went on. However, the sword of Cassiopeia needed the condensation of sword will. Obviously, he would not give 7 sin the time to do so. In the first sword strike, he had immediately resolved the battle. But was it true that 7 sin's sword contained fatal flaws? The answer was no. No cultivator in this world was perfect and without fault. No matter the ability of cultivation, there would always be weaknesses. Perhaps the only weakness of 7 sins was that for the sword of Cassiopeia to be released, it required a significant amount of sword will to turn it into an invincible sword. The sword of Cassiopeia would get stronger and stronger. Before, when all 13 swords were deployed, even someone as strong as Zong of the Dali Academy was unable to resist. Moreover, he could be stronger still. But it did require some time for the sword will to condense, and did that matter? With the sword will that flowed upon 7 sins, even if there was no sword of Cassiopeia, his offense and defense were still solid. Not to mention, he had incorporated spatial will and integrated it into the sword will so that it could tear the void in its progression. Previously, even Zong's might of the Great Path was unable to trap him. So, how could this be considered a fatal flaw? But at the moment, the 7th swordsman did not allow 7 sins to strike with the sword. And before the sword of Cassiopeia could be unleashed, he had cut the formation of the sword short. Because the sword of the 7th swordsman was not any weaker than the sword of Cassiopeia, and he was also an expert in spatial will, by locking onto the body of 7 sins, the sword broke through the void, hence the brilliant sword strike that everyone witnessed. If 7 sin had time to gather multiple swords of Cassiopeia, it would be difficult to know who was strong and who was weak. But since the 7th swordsman could deter him from launching his sword, that itself proved that the way of the sword of the 7th swordsman was more convincing than that of 7 sins. Excellent, Li Sun praised. Though there was only 1 strike fro the sword, it was a superb one. Not only Li Sun, everyone around looked at Yi Futian with a slightly changed attitude. This first swordsman from the lower worlds, with just 1 sword strike, convinced all the top figures who were present to recognize his strength. Before, many had thought that this battle was, to Yi Futian, to seek the way, to learn of the sword, and to observe the swords of Jianwu and 7 sins. But obviously, the 7th swordsman was proving that his sword was not inferior to anyone, even if it was someone as strong as 7 sins. As he said before to Li Sun, he ought to be included among those at the peak of swordsmanship below St. Plain. Liu also looked at Yi Futian with some shock. Even though she knew that he was strong, she did not expect that he was this strong. 7 sins was someone who had defeated Zong of the Dali Academy. When Yi Futian stepped out, he was ignored by the people of Daily Mountain. But then, when the 2 significant cultivators of Daily Mountain faced him, each was only able to release 1 single sword strike. Even at this moment, All the top figures of Dali who were present focused their attention on him. Jian Wu, at this moment, the shadow-bearing sword saint spoke, "Your turn." In the direction of Sword Mountain, Jian Wu's sight directed toward Yi Futian from a distance. He stepped forward. Shadow-bearing sword saint had asked him to fight some swordsmen from the lower worlds, and it was not something he was willing to do. However, the shadow-bearing sword saint was his elder, so he still obeyed. When he saw the Sword of Seven Sins today, he thought that his opponent would be Seven Sins. But Yi Futian proved his worth with his sword, that he deserved an exchange. Jian Wu walked out, and each of his steps contained a terrifying sword will. The swordsmanship clouding the sky and causing a sword storm of sword chi. Jian Wu, the first disciple of Sword Mountain, the first sword below saint in the Dali Imperial City. Seventh swordsman, the first person below Saint Plane in the lower worlds. Both of them used sword in their name. Jian Wu's body levitated and appeared upon the void, standing opposite Yi Futian. With the sword will wrapped around him, and real, physical swords bloomed between heaven and earth. This storm headed directly toward Yi Futian. However, Yi Futian was also protected by the same force, so the two storms of swordsmanship collided, and a truly suffocating might now filled this space. Some cultivators below the Saint Plane felt that if they came between the two, they may not be able to withstand the sword will and might be torn into pieces. At this time, Jian Wu extended his palms, and suddenly, in front of his palms, the sword will gathered, turning into swords, and transparent swords surrounded his body. "Water of autumn," Jian Wu said, and the sword broke through the sky and moved toward Yi Futian. On top of Yi Futian, burning flames hung high above the sky as a sun. His hand reached out, and suddenly, a sword gathered in his hand, a sword of burning flame. The sword unleashed, and fire dragons roared and burned through the void. "Blazing sun," Yi Futian also commanded, and the two sword wills circled and colliding. Jian Wu seemed not to have noticed, and the sword will once again condensed and gave rise to a sky full of swords. Between heaven and earth, there appeared a starry sky. "Meteor." Jian Wu pointed forward, and suddenly, another sword broke through the sky, descending with meteor sword will. Yi Futian looked up at his surroundings, and there was another will of frost materializing around him. "Hail," a voice commanded, and the sword of ice went toward the sword of meteor. Heaven and the earth seemed to be frozen, which blocked the meteor from falling. Jian Wu's body floated in a forward movement. Both of his hands stretched out. Above the sky, a great and stunning sword will manifested everywhere. The moment. Cued by the command, swords came out to attack, and the affectation of the moment was everywhere. Boom. Yi Futian took a step forward, and the sword whistled in the sky, and a storm of destruction raged. Storm. With the strike of the sword, the horrible storm of horror seemed to flood this space. Chijue's swordsmanship of Sword Mountain. All the cultivators of Dali gazed upon the battlefield. Chijue's swordsmanship used 7 kinds of sword wills to manifest and depended on each swordsman's cultivation. The results were not all the same. But Chijue's swordsmanship gradually increased in layers. Its power was shocking, and every time the sword struck, it was to gather sword force so that the sword strikes towards the end were more terrifying. Chijue's sword realm contained all the swordsmanship. At the moment, above the sky, there was an infinite number of sharp swords falling. In its succeeding gloom, this space had completely turned into a world of the swords, Jian Wu's Chijue sword realm. All in all, Jian Wu's eyes were extremely sharp, and from those eyes came a terrible light. Of the 7, 4 had already been dispersed. When the sword struck out, it turned into all, and contained all. It was everywhere, omnipotent, and could destroy all. Above Yi Futian, a terrible thunderstorm exploded, sweeping the entire space, shattering all things. He stepped out again, and this time went toward Jian Wu. In the battle between swordsmen, the only way was forward, and there was no retreat. Thunder. Another sword emerged, and heaven and earth seemed to be destroyed by way of the sword. Thunder sword strikes smashed the void and cleaved open the great path. Densify. Jian Wu's eyes turned into sword eyes, and inside his pupils, the space of the sword realm was reflected. Yi Futian only felt that this sword realm was unreal, just like a hell made of sword way. Heavy swords condensed and came into being, immense and incomparable. Each step he took shook the void. The heavy sword broke through the air and blasted into all 8 directions of the land, suppressing the sword realm. The end of day. Jian Wu unleashed the 6th sword, and the Qijue sword realm turned into real doomsday. The infinite sword will intended to pierce the sword realm and madly moved to attack Yi Futian. Yi Futian waved both hands, his feet upon the void, and sharp swords surrounded him. Infinity. Rolls of sword veil swung out, seemingly infinite, annihilating all swordsmanship. Everyone who was watching the battle looked at the scene of horror in the void, and many people trembled in their hearts. Was this the battle of the peak swordsmanship below the Saint Plain? Whether it was Jian Wu or the 7th swordsman, they were both fearfully strong. But at this moment, the 7th swordsman was shrouded by Qijue sword realm and was significantly restricted by it. Even so, he was still able to block the 6th sword with his sword of incomparable aggression. However, the space seemed to be shattered and destroyed. How sharp would the next sword be? Just then, Jian Wu closed his eyes and seemed to have integrated into the sword realm, and his body was spinning. Suddenly, the infinite sword will between heaven and earth gathered together and merged into the sword realm. This entire sword realm seemed to be turning and crushed everything within. Funeral of the gods. A sharp voice came from inside the sword realm, and the sword will of destruction suddenly shattered the void. The funeral of the gods was precisely that. Even the gods would be buried in the Qijue sword realm. Yi Futian stared at this devastating storm. The sword realm buried all things and shattered all things. Even the clothes on his body were shredded. His swordsmanship seemed unable to defend this force. At the moment, the aura upon his body had already reached its peak, and the sword force of heaven and earth seemed to gather together. In this storm, he held a sword, and with every step that was taken, the sword force was still climbing higher and strengthened further. There was a sword mark between heaven and earth, tearing up the void. Wherever Yi Futian passed, everything seemed to be pulverized. The storm became stronger, rushing toward him. Finally, Yi Futian's sword was unleashed. This sword would end all things. When the sword struck, a storm broke out, and his body moved with the sword, using the sword to tear apart the funerary storm. Sizzling sounds were heard, and the sword will madly teared and destroyed. The sword realm seemed to have been opened, and then tore apart bit by bit until the sword realm was fully opened. All saw that sword rocket upward, like a sacred sword, a true sword strike that could cleft the sky in two. The sword light crossed the heaven and the earth, and a sword opened up the sky. With a loud boom, the storm of destruction raged between the sky and the earth, and the Qijue sword realm was broken. In the sword realm, there came a groan. Jian Wu flew out backward, and at the corner of his mouth, there was a streak of blood. The first person in the younger generation of Sword Mountain, the sharpest sword below Saint in the Dali dynasty, Jian Wu, was defeated. Of course, he was no longer the strongest sword below Saint in Dali Imperial City. The 7th swordsman had replaced him. At this time, the aura on Yi Futian's body was slightly shallow. Jian Wu was already incredibly strong, but the final sword of End All appeared as one strike but gathered the momentum of all the sword attacks before it. With his terrible power integrated within, along with the space-shredding rules, he had turned the End All power of the halberd of time and space into the swordsmanship that would end all things. Therefore, there was that beautiful sword strike opening the sword realm of the other. The shadow-bearing sword saint looked at Yi Futian, speechless. For this arrogant but pure-hearted swordsman of the lower worlds, he had asked Jian Wu to come down from the mountain to defeat him. But now, even Jian Wu of Sword Mountain was defeated in battle. Just as the 7th swordsman had said, would this confirm that he learned from all things of the world to comprehend the swordsmanship of all things, which was more suitable than the swordsman of the Sword Mountain? Then, why go to Sword Mountain at all? Could it be that this seeker as destiny was not with Sword Mountain after all? No one would have thought that the seventh swordsman from the lower worlds would triumph over the two mighty swordsmen Seven Sins and Jian Wu. The young man who had come to the Dali Academy to seek instruction once upon a time now used these two battles to prove to the world that he was the first sword under the Dali dynasty. After this battle, below the Saint Plain, there is nothing more to ask regarding the swordsmanship. The road ahead can only be the divine path, Yi Futian said. Although the words sounded proud, they were the truth. He had reached the apex of the sword way below the Saint Plain in Dali. From now on, what lied in front of him could only be the divine path. Li Sun looked at Yi Futian with a smile. Our Dali dynasty is full of talent. Even the people of the lower worlds are standing at the peak below the Saint Plain. I am looking forward to the future of Dali dynasty. Li Sun looked at Yi Futian with a smile. Our Dali dynasty is full of talent. Even the people of the lower worlds are standing at the peak below the Saint Plain. I am looking forward to the future of Dali dynasty. Next to Li Sun, the imperial advisor of Dali also looked at Yi Futian. The fortune of Dali was changing, and there could be turmoil in the future. However, he could not yet see the cause of the change in fortune. Dali dynasty was prosperous. It had many strong cultivators in its command. Even though he had had words with the two kings of Dali, he would still avoid the conflict with the two kings at all costs. Their ideologies slightly conflicted, but they were all acting in the best interest of Dali, and no one dared to trespass. Otherwise, even the two kings would not be able to afford the anger of the emperor of Dali. This seeker was a wild card and came from the lower worlds. Would he be the one? Seventh swordsman, the imperial advisor called out. Suddenly Yi Futian looked toward the imperial advisor of Dali. This was the first time he looked at the imperial advisor. Because the other had called out to him, he could look back at the imperial advisor with good reason. I heard Lu Chuan saying that you cultivated in the lower worlds and were enlightened. You comprehended the swordsmanship in 30 years, with nature and heaven and earth as your teacher? Asked the imperial advisor. Yes, Yi Futian nodded. His battle techniques had integrated the way of all things in the world into his swordsmanship and turned it into sword arts that was without weakness. The sun, the ice, the storm, the thunder, and lightning, even the way of space, contained all things of the universe. Although it seemed that his talent was rather particular, among the many cultivators of the Dali dynasty, having such one genius was not surprising. Your life spirit, let me take a look, the advisor of Dali said. He hadn't seen Yi Futian's life spirit. What kind of life spirit could comprehend the way of all things in heaven and earth? Yi Futian's heart trembled slightly. At this moment he was a little nervous. He was unambiguous that possessing such talent would naturally cause the curiosity of those in power in Dali. To cultivators, the life spirit was vital. The request from the imperial advisor of Dali to see his life spirit was not because he doubted his identity. No one would see a genius and immediately suspect that this person was a fraud. This was not a rational thought process. Perhaps the imperial advisor of Dali wanted to know how this swordsman from the lower worlds was so outstanding. He also knew what came next would be the key, and he had already thought about it. Very well. Many thoughts that flooded his mind, but Yi Futian did not hesitate to agree. In the Life Palace, a sword shuttled around the ancient tree of the world. A rustling came from the ancient tree. Curious aura blended into the sword will and surrounded the sword. Subsequently, the sword whistled and rushed out of the Life Palace. Outside, a brilliant sword rocketed upward, and this sword was incredibly radiant. The instant he appeared, the worldly spiritual chi could not resist but gather together. It was as if this sword had an affinity with all the other spiritual chi of the universe. The sword crossed in the void and was gone in a flash. Then it buried itself into Yi Futian and returned to his Life Palace. The attention of the imperial advisor of Dali landed on Yi Futian. In this instant, although Yi Futian stood there quietly, he was very nervous inside. He did not know whether or not the will of the ancient tree of the world that he had integrated into the sword will had any flaws. He had tested it before. In his opinion, there were no issues. The cultivators of the world were endless, and it was the same with life spirits. Many people's particular life spirits carried with them various attributes. No matter what power of attributes his life spirit was carrying, it was also entirely reasonable. The sword spirit in harmony with nature and heaven and earth is a considered full attribute. You are indeed suitable to be taught by all things in the universe and refine the all-method swordsmanship. If you could render harmony between them, there would be no sword you could not master. The imperial advisor of Dali nodded slightly and was not surprised. It was as if the full attribute sword spirit was completely expected. Otherwise, how could all things of the universe be its master? Moreover, Yi Futian's sword spirit not only had an affinity toward the full attribute, but he also perceived an incredibly fantastic force. It was as if he was born to fit into the way of the world. His perception was not incorrect, but what he sensed belonged to the life spirit of the ancient tree of the world, which caused him to misjudge. Imperial advisor, it seems that Lu Chuan brought us an amazing genius of the swordsmanship from the lower worlds. He smiled and said, "Seventh swordsman, are your parents still in the lower worlds?" "I don't know who my parents were." Yi Futian's tone was a bit cold, and it seemed to reflect a faint sadness, but it was the truth. It was true that until now, he still did not know who his biological parents were. That old guy, Yi Baichuan, did not tell him anything, and now he was missing. And his godfather had never mentioned it either. It was as if he was an orphan. Li Sun nodded lightly and did not say anything more. "You may go," the imperial advisor said. Yi Futian nodded, and then returned to his seat on the side of Li Yu in a flash. When Li Yu looked toward him, there was a strange color in her beautiful eyes. She said with a smile, "It seems that I underestimated you, the first swordsman below St. Plain in Dali. The road of cultivation is without end, but the first sword below St. Plain in Dali is nothing to be boastful of," Yi Futian said calmly. Li Yu blinked her eyes, and this dignified and noble princess revealed her side as a lady. "You are a sword idiot." Li Yu laughed softly, and her beautiful eyes stared straight ahead. Zhuozong, Seven Sins, Jian Wu, and Yi Futian had made exchanges. For the forum battle of the Dali Academy, who else would now dare to step out? The few people before were already peak figures beside Di Hao and Dong Chen. Even if they stepped onto the forum platform, they would not exceed anyone's expectations. This space was silent for some moments, and many eyes looked at the two figures. One stood in front of the crowd of the Dali Academy, while the other, in front of Daily Mountain. Next would be these two battling for glory. Today, Daily Mountain came to visit and seek instruction. These people came to Dali Academy to serve as witnesses of this moment. At this moment, Di Hao stepped out. He did not reveal any expression from beginning to end. Even though Yi Futian defeated Seven Sins in one sword strike, he still looked as if nothing had happened. He came today with only one goal, to defeat the best disciple of the Dali Academy, Dong Chen. Di Hao walked onto the forum platform and looked in the direction of the Dali Academy, and said, "Di Hao of Daily Mountain, asking for your instruction." The clothes upon his body moved without wind. A solemn atmosphere shrouded this space. Soon after, everyone saw that Dong Chen had stepped out and stood opposite Di Hao. There was no breath released from either one of them, but there was an invisible wind blowing, which was caused by both of their auras. Dali Dynasty, below the St. Plain, two figures at the peak. At this time, an invisible storm swept out and beat on Dong Chen's body. He felt that this force oppressed his soul and was extremely suffocating. Di Hao was still standing there, but it seemed that he was everywhere. At this time, Di Hao stepped forward and walked out. A bell ring sounded across the land, causing a devastating spiritual storm between heaven and earth. When it swept through, Dong Chen closed his eyes slightly and felt that his spiritual will was shaking. He felt a very strong sound wave blast out, intending to erase his spiritual will. God-burying bell. Many elders from the Dali Academy had seen and known many things, and in just a moment, they had identified the kind of magical power of this sound wave attack. This was a kind of sound magic. It could disregard defensive forces and shatter the spiritual willpower of others through the air, destroying others' minds. It was incomparably aggressive. Although the others' understanding of Di Hao was limited, they did not doubt that his power was great. Otherwise, no one would have named him the first person below Saint Plain in Dali. Now, when they heard this God-bearing bell, many knew that Dong Chen was in big trouble. The God-bearing bell was an aggressive mental attack, capable of greatly damaging the spiritual power of Dong Chen, thus weakening his combat effectiveness. It was not probable for this to be the only kind of ability that Di Hao was an expert in. There must be other extremely strong methods he had at his disposal. Dong Chen closed his eyes, and there was a mighty storm of spiritual power that appeared upon his body, which blended with the heavens and the earth. It echoed with the great path. Suddenly he was covered with dazzling brilliance. Another bell ring rocked the world, sweeping toward them. In front of Dong Chen, the invisible spiritual attack materialized and turned into half-shadows of the ancient bell. It blasted toward him. This was a compelling and mystical method of the Dali Academy, which could make the spirit will power materialize. Dali Academy was built by Emperor of Dali, according to the specifications of the Imperial Advisor, and contained many mysterious and compelling methods. Dong Chen was the first person of the younger generations of Dali Academy, so he cultivated many great and powerful abilities. Di Hao continued moving forward, and the bell kept ringing. The invisible storm turned into bell rings that continued to attack Dong Chen. At this moment, Dong Chen's fingers stretched out, and above the 5 fingers of his right hand, radiant and mysterious brilliance encircled them. At the moment the half-shadows of the ancient bell attacked, his fingers pressed down toward the front, and there seemed to be hundreds of thousands of fingers of catastrophe that reached out, blasting upon the ancient bell and destroyed it into smithereens. But at this point, Di Hao's aura had already elevated to an extremely dominant level. Both of his hands stretched out, and suddenly, there was a large sacred tripod, hundreds of meters high, that appeared behind him. The sacred tripod rotated, and there was a crushing atmosphere appearing above the firmament. On the area above the forum platform, many tripods appeared at the same time, suspended in midair. It was as if they were all controlled by Di Hao. The tripods spun at the same time, gathering a terrifying storm of suppression. From those tripods, images of the dragon and elephant could be faintly detected. Its might suffocated the sky, and everything was on the verge of being flattened and overruled. Tripod of dragon and elephant. The cultivators of Dali Academy looked up. It was yet another aggressive attack. The tripod in itself was a symbol of suppression. Most cultivators who cultivated in the method of tripods were experts at suppression rules power. And the tripod of dragon and elephant was the most excellent method among them. The tripod integrated the power of the dragon and elephant and could even suppress the great path. Many of the disciples of the Dali Academy and Daily Mountain felt that their feet were floating. Those whose cultivation was weaker felt their legs slightly trembling. Even if they were not located below, they still felt oppressed and had difficulty breathing. Many of the disciples of the Dali Academy had a look of unease on their faces. Di Hao's strength was simply beyond imagination. Was this the might of the way that someone in the sage plane could release? It was just like the might of the divine path. Dong Chen was just underneath the might, and the pressure he felt was naturally the strongest. Dong Chen was just underneath the might, and the pressure he felt was naturally the strongest. The radiance on his body was still brilliant, and the thousands of fingers of catastrophe pointed to attack the invisible ancient bell of the great path. But at this moment, the bell and the tripod both hummed. The bell shattered the souls of men, annihilating the divine spirit. The tripod crushed everything, oppressed the physical body. The tripod of dragon and elephant suppressed the great path. Both of Dong Chen's hands made the mudra, and suddenly, there was a crisp clinking sound from his body. There was a terrible radiance shining upon him. And suddenly the battle form of Vajra appeared, which grew larger and larger, reaching as high as hundreds of meters, just like the battle form of the great path. Moreover, the battle form of Vajra gave birth to many arms, and the will of the great path flowed, and all the arms simultaneously struck. The immense palms contained horrific mudra method. The elders of the Dali Academy nodded slightly. Dong Chen was the premier disciple below St. Plain in the Dali Academy. Now he combined the battle form of will and two other magical means to create a perfect blend of power, exploding amazing power. Dong Chen, whose comprehension of the cultivation had always been strong, so he could understand the true meaning within. The tripod of dragon and elephant dropped down and wiped out everything. The great palm of Vajra blasted upon it and caused a violent hurricane. The clothes of those who were around watching the battle had fluttered uncontrollably, and the might of the path blasting toward them. Those sages whose realm were lower were blasted backward, and it was difficult for them to remain standing. Di Hao was still moving forward, and the bell rings shook the sky. The tripod of dragon and elephant, like a divine tripod, with golden rays came out of it, just like the light of the great path, directed toward Dong Chen. At this moment, everyone seemed to be able to perceive just how strong the oppressive force that Dong Chen was enduring. That immense and incomparable Vajra battle form seemed to be on the verge of being crushed. A loud bang, and numerous lines of light appeared on Dong Chen's battle form, extending along the battle form toward the arms. Above the sky, numerous arms blasted out at the same time, creating an extremely brilliant golden pattern from which endless brilliance exuded, and collided with the light from the divine tripod. The two forces were jousting with one another. Di Hao stretched out both of his hands, his robe fluttered, and a mighty aura bloomed from him, which then turned extremely sharp. With his body as the center, there was a sudden storm of sword will, and behind him a glorious golden sword appeared. He is also good at swordsmanship? Everyone looked on with shock. Di Hao had already released 3 major life spirits, all of them were martial spirits. Bell, tripod, sword. At the moment, he stood on the forum platform like the king of the divine soldiers. When the sword will was whistling, the infinite sword will once again gathered in front of him. Under the gaze of everyone, the sword of Kasyapa that was previously used by 7 sins was once again manifesting. Sword of Kasyapa, Di Hao knows it too. Many disciples of the younger generation were trembling in their hearts and extremely shocked. Moreover, the sword of Kasyapa from Di Hao was even stronger than that of the 7 sins. Many people showed a look of curiosity. Everyone had thought the battle of the swordsmanship had ended, but no one expected Di Hao was also good at the sword. However, the sword spirit was only one of Di Hao's life spirits, of which he had 3 major ones, and each one of them was extremely aggressive. If Yi Futian claimed that his previous fight with 7 sins, there were flaws with 7 sins, then Di Hao was undoubtedly perfect without any faults. The bell rings suppressed the spiritual willpower, the tripod of dragon and elephant suppressed all things, and now with the rebirth of the swordsmanship, how tyrannical was this strength? The people of Daily Mountain appeared calm without any look of surprise. Naturally they knew how strong Di Hao was. Even 7 sins was observing the battle calmly. His own strength was already incredibly strong. There were few rivals below the St. Plain who could be his equal, and in the entire Dali Imperial City there were hardly anyone who could counter him. This was why he could defeat number 2 of the Dali Academy, Zhuozong, with overwhelming advantage. However, Di Hao was someone that he admired greatly, and was also someone that he felt he could never surpass. With Di Hao around, everyone else could only fight for the second spot. Although he was very strong, if he had fought with Di Hao, he would be defeated very badly. Whether it was from the beginning or allowing him to release the Sword of the Peak, he would be crushed either way. There was no need to stop him from gathering the Sword of Kasyapa as the 7th swordsman had done. Imperial Advisor, Dong Chen seemed to be under great pressure. Li Sun said to the man next to him, "I had no idea that uncle had adopted such a powerful godson." The Imperial Advisor of Dali looked at the battlefield quietly. The strength of Di Hao was indeed at the apex below St. Plain. Such ability was nearly invincible. Swords of Kasyapa now gathered and manifested. Unlike 7 sins, Di Hao could gather multiple swords of Kasyapa, and in an instant the swords whistled in the sky. The bell was still ringing, and the tripod of dragon and elephant was still in a deadlock with Dong Chen, and with such terrifying swordsmanship suppressing, it could only be imagined just how much pressure Dong Chen was facing. Dong A loud bang, and the many arms of Dongchen were unleashed at the same time, and the currents upon his body were extremely aggressive. He then went in the direction of Di Hao. Not only did he not retreat, but instead he headed toward the other. Go! Di Hao's fingers pointed toward the front, and the sword of Cassiopeia penetrated the void, reaching the limit of speed. Buzz! At this moment, there were many afterimages appeared in front, and they were all images of Dongchen, and these images seemed to be as real as could be. The swords of Cassiopeia whizzed by, and all the afterimages were shattered, and yet other images were constantly condensing and appear, and seemed to be increasing. Not only that, but above these condensing illusions, there was also an extremely powerful spiritual will. Di Hao actually felt threatened. Suddenly the tripod of dragon and elephant flew back, and appeared in the area above him. The vastness of the might descended. He continued to move forward, and the bell and the tripod sounded at the same time. His palms pushed out, and the swords of Cassiopeia that were whistling suddenly ran through the void, and madly slaughtered in the space, wanting to smash and pulverize the space, and destroy all the images of Dongchen. Above the sword of Cassiopeia, there was a great murderous intent hidden within. This was the powerful murderous will that Di Hao had refined from his experience on the battlefield. The Vajra battle form exploded from an afterimage, blocking the sword will that was madly attacking. At the same moment, the battle form rushed forward and directly oppressing Di Hao's true location. Di Hao showed no fear. The tripod of dragon and elephant descended from the sky, destroyed everything, and blasted toward the battle form. The many arms of the battle form raised up to support the tripod of dragon and elephant. Dongchen's body carried the radiant glory with him as he moved forward. He was surrounded by a sacred light, as if it was not below the Saint Plane any longer, but had already entered the presence of the divine path. Di Hao's hands closed together, and the swordsmanship surrounding him hummed together. The sword of Cassiopeia broke through from the sky. With the body of Dongchen as the center, it was attacking instantly, fast as can be. Many disciples of the Dali Academy clenched their fists tightly and revealed a look of worry on their faces. At this moment, the sword of Cassiopeia and millions of sword will came together, shattering the void, and was completely indefensible. But Dongchen did not pay any attention to it and just continued moving forward. When the sword came for the attack, it passed through his body. Just as the sword about to descend on Dongchen, it stopped abruptly. The glory on Dongchen shrouded the space within it. The sword screamed wildly, and Di Hao stepped forward again, his fingers extended, continued the command for the sword to attack. A loud sound was heard, and in this moment, Dongchen's body split once again, producing bodies outside of bodies, colliding directly with the swords of Cassiopeia, and was crushed by the swords. Buzz! The might of Great Path descended in front of Di Hao, and a phantom image penetrated the attack of swordsmanship and came in front of Di Hao. Dongchen's body seemed to be unreal. His fingers pressed down toward Di Hao, who was in front. In an instant, heaven and earth were suffocated, everything seemed to be at a standstill, with only this one finger existing. When this one finger went down, the Great Path descended, and Di Hao only felt that his soul was going to be broken. He knew that Dongchen's strongest attacking technique was the God Destroyer. The powerful spiritual will that he released was shattered. The invisible force enveloped his body and seemed to take apart his soul. A glorious ancient bell surrounded his body, as if it was one with his body, and like Dongchen, one of his fingers also pointed forward. With this finger, the heaven and earth resonated, the Great Path connected, sharper than sword, and contained supreme way of suppression. The fingers of the two men collided together, and suddenly formed an atmosphere of total destruction. The flesh and the spiritual will seemed to be crushed. Bell, tripod, and the sword all hummed, intending to shatter the Great Path. Boom! A loud bang, the light of destruction swept out, and the people only saw the two bodies were shocked backward at the same time. Di Hao retreated unsteadily and let out a groan. Dongchen's body flew backwards. It seemed that there was a murderous sword will that penetrated the body, and inside the body there came a roaring sound. Poof! He spat out a mouthful of blood, looking pale. Dong Qin, defeated. The hearts of the people trembled. Dong Qin, the first person below the Saint Plain from Dali Academy, was defeated. Di Hao of Daily Mountain, godson of King Tiandao, the first person below Saint Plain in Dali Dynasty. Much obliged, Di Hao put his hands together and bowed. His clothes fluttered as he said to Dong Qin. Although he had won, but he still respected Dong Qin's strength. Dong Qin also saluted, then retired, without say anything more. Defeat was defeat. In this battle, he had shouldered great responsibility, but he still lost. Daily Mountain came to seek the way, and triumphed over the first holy land of cultivation in Dali Dynasty, the Dali Academy. After the shock, many people looked at the imperial advisor, only to see him sitting there, looking casual, and no one had any idea what he was thinking. This battle can be said to be the Battle of the Peaks below Saint Plain in Dali Imperial City. Di Hao took a few steps forward, looking at the imperial advisor of Dali, and bowed gently, saying, "I heard that the imperial advisor wanted to take on apprentices, so I came from Daily Mountain asked to be instructed by the Dali Academy. I would like to be accepted under the imperial advisor as an apprentice." When Di Hao finished speaking, everyone was stupefied in a moment. Dong Qin came to the Dali Imperial City when the imperial advisor had wanted to accept disciples, and everyone thought that Dong Qin would become a disciple of the imperial advisor. In the eyes of many, Di Hao's arrival was undoubtedly to provoke trouble. But at this moment, Di Hao claimed that he had come to Dali Dynasty to seek the way, and that he wanted to be the apprentice of the imperial advisor to continue to cultivate. How could the people not be shocked? Dong Qin was even more pale, but he sighed. He was defeated and had no qualification whatsoever to apprentice under the imperial advisor. Once again everyone looked to the imperial advisor. As the first person below Saint Plain, Di Hao had requested to be his apprentice. Would the imperial advisor agree? The imperial advisor of Dai was also surprised by Di Hao's request, but he soon recovered. Obviously, this was also not unexpected. There were many cultivators in Dali Academy, but at that moment, they were all quiet, and most of them were looking at the imperial advisor and Di Hao. No one had expected this to happen. The disciples of Dali Academy were all in extremely low spirits. After all, they had lost terribly as Daily Mountain came to seek the path. There were many cultivators in Dali Academy, but at that moment, they were all quiet, and most of them were looking at the imperial advisor and Di Hao. No one had expected this to happen. The disciples of Dali Academy were all in extremely low spirits. After all, they had lost terribly as Daily Mountain came to seek the path. Although they had won the first battle of lower-level sages, after the seven sins had come forward, it had seemed that that battle had only happened for the purpose of educating Kuang Shao. He had used the sword of Kasyapa to defeat Zuozong. Next, Di Hao had defeated Dong Qin and had asked to be taken as the disciple of the headmaster of Dali Academy, the imperial advisor of the Dali Dynasty. This was naturally hard to bear for the disciples of Dali Academy. However, Di Hao had wanted to be taken as a disciple and had let everybody know it. Even though Dali Academy, which he founded, had been defeated, he was still second only to Emperor Li. Why else would King Tiandao have sent his adopted son to be trained by him? No matter what their goal was, this was a recognition of the imperial advisor's power and position. The imperial advisor looked up at Di Hao and asked him, "If you want to become my disciple, you must tell me, why do you seek the path?" Di Hao stared at him. His adopted father, King Tiandao, had once told him that he looked at the imperial advisor as an opponent, but at the same time, he still respected him greatly. That was because people of talent appreciated each other. Thus, he had sent him to become the imperial advisor's disciple, learning from him and seeking the path with him. That was why he had come here for today's battle. I seek the path to be able to sweep over the battlefield and plan victory from 1,000 miles away. To be able to protect the Dali dynasty from within, and sweep away all external threats, and make the Dali dynasty prosperous, said Di Hao. All the people of Daily Mountain had trained in the army, and so his thoughts were naturally those of a soldier. He wanted to conquer the world, sweep away all threats, and seize resources of the great path. Oh! The imperial advisor nodded slightly, then looked away. Di Hao felt himself relax quite a bit. Before, when the imperial advisor had been looking at him, he had felt like he was under a lot of pressure. Under that pressure, if he had spoken insincerely, the imperial advisor would have perceived it. As for whether or not the imperial advisor was satisfied with what he had said, he did not know. The imperial advisor had cultivated himself so highly that he could see right through him, but he could not see through to the imperial advisor's thoughts. Dong Chen, called the imperial advisor. Dong Chen suddenly stepped forward. Headmaster, he said. The imperial advisor was also the headmaster of Dali Academy, and so there was nothing improper about calling him headmaster there. Lift your head, said the imperial advisor. Dong Chen lifted his head, and in that instant, felt the same thing that Di Hao had, an invisible pressure. Those deep and wise eyes seemed to pierce right through him, looking into his very soul. Even if he was not purposely putting pressure on him, the force that Dong Chen felt was still great. When one had cultivated to the peak of the saint level, if he willed it, his every move would be like the authority of heaven. And you? Why do you seek the path? Asked the imperial advisor. When they heard what the imperial advisor said, the disciples of Dali Academy had hope once again. When choosing a disciple, he would not just rely on talent and power. Perhaps Dong Chen still had hope. I seek the path to seek knowledge. I want to see great things, and be like you, teaching the path to the people of the Dali dynasty to increase their levels of cultivation, said Dong Chen with a bow. The imperial advisor was an idol to the students of Dali Academy, and they worshipped him. Even Dong Chen, the #1 junior at the academy, was the same. His respect and worship for the imperial advisor were no less than anyone else's. Thus, Dong Chen's goal was everything that the imperial advisor had now. He wanted to become like the imperial advisor, and so he took him as a model. Oh! The imperial advisor nodded again, just like with Di Hao. No one could see if he was pleased or displeased, or which one of them he favored. Everyone felt a bit uneasy as they saw the imperial advisor turn his gaze and look into the crowd. Finally, his eyes fell upon Yi Futian. He said, "Seventh swordsman, Lu Chuan has praised you highly, and Sword Mountain has come for you. Why is it that you seek the path of swordsmanship?" A shocked look came over everyone's faces as they heard this. The imperial advisor was questioning seventh swordsman. Could it be that he was considering him as well? Yi Futian looked up at the imperial advisor and then stepped forward. The imperial advisor looked at him, and suddenly he had the same feeling that Dong Chen and Di Hao had had. I seek the path of swordsmanship to reach the highest level of swordsmanship, master, answered Yi Futian. He avoided the imperial advisor's gaze, keeping his head down. The imperial advisor kept looking at him, then said calmly, "Look up at me. You seek the path only to improve your swordsmanship?" It seemed that he knew Yi Futian had not spoken the truth. Yi Futian could only look up into the imperial advisor's eyes. He had a feeling that if he spoke falsely, the imperial advisor would see through him. At that moment, Yi Futian thought of his cultivation, not just his swordsmanship. Why did he seek the path? The incident at Donghai, the unstable situation at Nandu, the chaos at East Baron College, the disaster of the Baron State. As he thought of this, Yi Futian's heart was like still water. He looked at the imperial advisor and said, "When I was young I was often bullied, and thus I put my whole heart towards cultivating. You asked me why I seek the path. I do so that one day I can be carefree and happy. And on that day, even if I don't cultivate, I will still have the right to choose freely." Everyone looked at Yi Futian. It seemed that seventh swordsman also had this side to him. Of course, this also appeared to be the wish of the vast majority of common cultivators. The people of this world all face a difficult choice. Having the right to choose freely is not easy at all, and if you don't cultivate, then even if you don't try to get involved in the affairs of the world, you might still be affected, said the imperial advisor. Your requirements are a bit high. Yi Futian nodded. That is indeed the way it is, and that is why the only option is to seek the path. He did not speak of the path of swordsmanship, he just talked about the path, openly and honestly. Di Hao and Dong Chen both care about the cultivation of all the people in the world, but when you seek the path, you do it only for yourself, said the imperial advisor. Man first loves himself, then may he love others. He first establishes himself, then he may talk about doing good for humanity, answered Yi Futian. Is this the boundary that you are cultivating towards? The imperial advisor seemed a bit interested as he continued to ask Yi Futian questions. Yi Futian thought of Mr. Du's wishes and thought of his path of cultivation so far. He looked at the imperial advisor and said, "The great path knows no boundaries." The imperial advisor nodded and said nothing. Li Sun looked at Yi Futian with a smile and said, "What you have said is quite interesting, Seventh Swordsman. The poor think only of themselves, while the distinguished work for the good of the whole world, no? And as for the great path having no boundaries, the whole world is bounded. How can there be no boundaries?" "What you have said is so, Your Majesty. I was speaking foolishly." Yi Futian would naturally not contradict him. He was an imperial prince. They were on entirely different levels. To each their own. What you said was not foolish. In fact, I think it was very interesting, said Li Sun with a smile. Who will you choose as your disciple, imperial advisor? Today, the imperial advisor of Dali dynasty would choose a disciple to teach personally. He was very curious, would it be Di Hao, or would he still select Chen Dong? Dong Chen was the one that most people had expected him to choose. And his ideals were well suited to everything that the imperial advisor had done up till now. Of course, Di Hao had defeated Dong Chen and had actively asked to be accepted as a disciple. His goals for cultivation took different roads to the same place with Dong Chen's. There was not a huge difference in their characters. As for Yi Futian, people generally thought that he was best suited for Sword Mountain. Pursuing the path of swordsmanship comfortably and naturally was their way. I will announce my choice in 3 days, said the imperial advisor. Everyone looked surprised. He had originally intended to choose his disciple today, and yet he had pushed the time back 3 days. Could it be that he was hesitating? But no one dared to question the imperial advisor's decision. Excellent. Your disciple will one day be at the top of the Dali dynasty. You should indeed take your time to choose, said Li Sun with a nod. Thank you for coming here today, everyone. If you wish to stay here at Dali Academy as a guest, you may do so as you please, said the imperial advisor with a bow. Then he walked over to Li Sun and the others and said, Your Highness. Let's leave it here for today, said Li Sun with a bow. They said their farewells and dispersed. The people from Dali Mountain also gradually left, and the shadow-bearing sword saint walked over to Yi Futian. Elder, said Yi Futian, bowing. You won't go with me to Sword Mountain? Asked the shadow-bearing sword saint. You said that if I won, I wouldn't have to go, said Yi Futian. If he was cultivating at Sword Mountain, how could he kill Li Yao? It would be difficult to find a chance. He had to stay in Dali Imperial City. And given his performance today, someone would undoubtedly come to find him. Fine, said the shadow-bearing sword saint with a nod. It will be good for you to stay in the city and cultivate. You will certainly have a good future. Until we meet again. Until we meet again, said Yi Futian with a bow. The cultivators from Sword Mountain left. Jian Wu gave him a final look. You're going to refuse him? Liu asked Yi Futian. Yi Futian smiled and said, Let's go. And on saying so, they left. The people who had attended the sparring session at Dali Academy quickly scattered throughout the city. Di Hao's fame was like the sun at noon. He had defeated Dong Chen and had earned the reputation of being the best cultivator under the saint level. And he had asked to be the imperial advisor's disciple. At the same time, Seventh Swordsman's name was also resonating throughout the city. He had defeated Jian Wu of Sword Mountain. If it hadn't been for Di Hao, Seventh Swordsman probably would have become the most shocking figure of the day. Many people were speculating about who the imperial advisor would choose as a disciple. Di Hao or Dong Chen. The 3 days passed in the blink of an eye, as many people kept speculating. On that day, Yi Futian was cultivating as usual. It was just like he had said, all that was left before him was the divine path. Is Master Seventh Swordsman here? came a voice from outside his residence. Yi Futian opened his eyes and said, "Who is it?" "The household of Marquis Qingyi has come to pay a visit," came the voice. It seemed to be someone whom the Dali dynasty had made a marquis. "Please come in," said Yi Futian. A group of people walked in. They walked up towards him, and an old man at the front smiled and bowed to him. "I am always hearing the name Seventh Swordsman. Your swordsmanship is unmatched. You are truly a dragon among men." He was extremely familiar and friendly. A maid came up behind him, holding a brocade box. It seemed that they had brought a gift. "You are too kind, but to what do I owe the pleasure?" said Yi Futian with a bow. There was another extremely beautiful woman beside the old man. She was slim and graceful, fair and lovely. "My daughter loves swordsmanship, and when she heard of you, she wanted to come see you. I'm sorry that we had to bother you, so we brought some gifts to congratulate you on your victory," said the old man with a smile. Yi Futian looked at the woman beside him and saw that the shy look in her eyes made her even more delicate and charming. Yi Futian was stunned. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.